Hello and welcome to Researcher's Desk. Today I have the great pleasure of welcoming Sofia Oreland. Sofia is a PhD student just finishing, ready to hand in at the Faculty of Theology at Uppsala University. Sofia is going to be talking with us about faith-based climate activism, both in South Africa and Sweden. And I'm very much looking forward to listening to you, Sophia. Throughout your presentation, I'm going to turn my own camera off, and that's so that we get a really nice recording. If there's any technical difficulties, I'll suddenly appear. So, a warm welcome, Sophia. Thank you for spending your Wednesday lunchtime with us here at Researcher's Desk.
Thank you very much for providing me this opportunity to present my PhD findings. And I realize now I have the heading here is my thesis heading and not the heading for today, but it's still reaching beyond science because that's something that I find in my research. So yes, I'm just about to finish my PhD project, and the heading there is Pathfinding Amid Climate Catastrophe, Faith-Based Climate Activism in South Africa and Sweden. And I'm a PhD student at the Faculty of Theology at Uppsala University. So you will have a brief presentation of my findings. Navigating the complex and disruptive climate landscape marked by extreme weather events is challenging for people worldwide. This can create uncertainty about how to navigate, particularly given delays in political effective climate responses. In my study, I explore how faith-based climate activists in South Africa and Sweden, rooted in and strengthened by their religious faith, are pathfinding amid this climate catastrophe. Faith-based climate activists are actively seeking paths forward by advocating for political action and engaging in various forms of activism. So first, some background about my study. I'm focusing on faith-based climate activists because I'm aimed to deepen the understanding of how religious faith can shape and sustain climate action across diverse contexts. And I want to analyze how personal faith interacts with the structural challenges of the climate catastrophe. So it's a multi-sited study in South Africa and Sweden. And I frame the activists' activism as a pathfinding process. I'm doing that because I want to underline that their activism is contextually shaped, experience-based, and ongoing in a rapidly changing climate landscape. And I focus particularly on theologies in practices and how they manifest their understandings about the transcendent or about God in words and actions. So the methods used are interviews. That's the primary material. So I've interviewed 21 activists in Sweden and South Africa, but I've also done participant observations in both contexts. So who are the activists? Yeah, they all identify as religious, and their faith plays a very essential role in their climate activism. And I particularly looked for activists who are well articulated, who can reflect on the link between their activism and their religious faith. And I use the word activists with the meaning a person who aim to influence climate politics and policy making, or using other forms of public climate action. But I also want to note that not all the interviewees use the term activism themselves, about themselves. And they are in the age between 25 to 75. There are grassroots activists like local volunteers in faith-based organizations. Some are priests or pastors. Others are employees at national level of faith-based or secular climate organizations. In Sweden, they are all Christians. In South Africa, the Christians are in majority, but I also interviewed 2 Muslim and 2 Khoisan activists. And to give you a brief background of what kind of activism they do, In both contexts, they do campaigning like civil disobedience actions and strikes and petitions and the like. In South Africa, they also do lobbying at national and international levels. In South Africa, they also do community and environmental care projects within their local communities, like tree planting projects, food gardens, and cleanup projects. They also do awareness raising initiatives like teaching others in local faith communities and other spaces about the climate crisis. In Sweden, the activists mainly work with campaigning, and in Sweden, I also identified a specific kind of practice that I have termed contemplations. Many of the Swedish interviewees participated in something called Pilgrims Walk for Future. It was a pilgrimage organized by the Church of Sweden and other also faith-based, but also secular organizations, where the participants walked from Sweden, Vadstena, to Glasgow and the COP climate negotiations in Glasgow in 2021. And this manifested something very unique because they combined contemplation actions like prayers, celebrating worship, walking in silence, reading Bible texts, and so on. But at the same time, the whole pilgrimage was a protest action, a political protest action. So the goal with the whole event and the pilgrimage was to influence policymakers to take climate action. So that was a very clear example within the Swedish material of this kind of contemplations. The Swedish interviewees also focus very much on lifestyle changes, trying to reduce their own fossil fuel emissions by changing heating of their houses, what they eat and clothes and so on. So moving now to the findings, the pathfinding and the similarities between the two contexts. What was striking is that it was not the religious faith that initiated or started their climate activism. It was instead the climate crisis itself. But it was experience-based climate knowledge that serves as this landmark that started or initiated their activism. In South Africa, interviewees, they saw the consequences of the climate catastrophe within their own context, and this was what started their activism. Whereas in the Swedish context, it was more about reading about the climate crisis in popular scientific sources or watching films or encountering people from the global south who are suffering the consequences. So this is what initiated their activism. But looking what sustains and what I call serve as a compass for their pathfinding, here the faith and their spirituality comes into the picture. And I call it a relational spirituality that serves as a compass. Because all the activists have this kind of spiritual experience of being related to others, to God, to nature, and in South Africa also to ancestors and the land. And this kind of spirituality that is focused on the relational is a compass for both activists in both contexts. But in South Africa, this is manifested more like a collective spiritual identity rooted in their context and history and community. And I will quote Fatima, one of the Khoi activists, to illustrate this collective spiritual identity. She says, "The true spirituality of the indigenous people is that we can't separate ourselves from our creator, from our environment, or from the land. In our tradition, it's all in one," end quote. Meanwhile, in the Swedish context, this relational spirituality is more of an individual spiritual experience of interconnectedness, like momentary and localized experiences that often happen during climate activism. And I quote Jenny, who participated in this long pilgrimage from Sweden to Glasgow. and she explains this spiritual relatedness as this, I quote, "One gets closer and feels more that this is what we are dependent on. Yes, it is the earth, the light, the ground, and the rains that are what actually uphold our lives. I could feel that. It became a more lived reality that we belong to nature and depend on it." End quote. So it's not theological concepts that serve as their compass. It's more this kind of relational spirituality. But they have theologies, and I call it holistic theologies. And the theological imperative of these holistic theologies is that the transcendent reality and worldly matters, like the climate crisis, are intertwined. So this is what unites the activists in both contexts, this holistic theologies or theological imperative. So that means for them to be a person of faith is to be climate committed. You can't separate your faith from being committed to the climate cause. But this kind of theology is more focused on orthopraxy, meaning correct action, and not orthodoxy, like correct beliefs. And it's also through climate action they get closer to God, and they get to know God more deeply through their climate activism. Something that unites the activists in both contexts is that this kind of theology creates tension in relation to their local faith communities. So they feel that they can't really express this kind of theology within their local faith communities. So they have a strong longing for a local faith community where they can express this kind of theology. And it's striking how Muslim grassroots activists in Cape Town have the same sort of longing and frustration as a pastor in a Swedish context, longing for this space within their congregations to being able to commit to the climate. But it's also clear that this theological imperative or the holistic theologies of the activists doesn't really conflict with the theological statements of the religious institutions, because they all belong to religious institutions that have kind of strong theological statements on climate commitment. But the activist doesn't see this lived in practice in their local faith communities. So they identify a gap between the local community and the institutional level. Moving now to the more context-specific characteristics of their pathfinding process, starting with South Africa. I see that how the climate landscape is shaped really influence and make their pathfinding process very different in the two contexts. In the South African context, it's more like a lived contextual experience. I start with a quote by Stembiso. He says, "We live in a situation where climate change is a reality. It's a matter of survival. The fact that I'm still here today means I'm a survivor. The fact that I'm still alive today could be possible because I'm not in my hometown during the flooding." End quote. Stembiso came from an area that was really hard hit by flooding just recently before our interview. So his family was really suffering and hundreds of people died. So he really identified as a climate survivor. So this means that the South African activists work both on adaptation to the climate crisis situation and also mitigation, trying to advocate for reduction of fossil fuel emissions. So they work both with this adaptation and mitigation at the same time. Another characteristic of the South African pathfinding process is that they face diverse societal challenges within their context. So they really have to connect the climate crisis with other societal issues, such as unemployment, democracy problem, corruption, waste, water and energy security, food security. So they have to really connect these different things when they communicate climate crisis. one of the South African interviewees called this a Rubik's cube, that they have to fit all these kind of different challenges together with the climate crisis, both because they are intertwined, but also when they communicate, when they train others about the climate crisis. Or as one other interviewee said, it's a long list I'm going to give God one day. But looking at their cultural and religious context, they have existing paths to walk, because their context, their community, and their history is full of resources that have sort of paved the way for their activism. For example, key figures in the past, such as anti-apartheid fighters like the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who combined protests and faith, paved the way for this kind of activism today. And several of the South African activists also expressed that they believe that God intervened in history. So that means they trust God will intervene again. One Khoi activist said, because her people were suffering from genocide during the German colonizers, and she said, 80% of my people were killed during the genocide, but 20% survived, and that means God is with us. That was when we found God, so 20% at least survived. And for her, that's an argument that she trusts that God will intervene again in the future and helping them with the climate crisis. So this kind of contextual spiritual identity, having this history as a resource, become a resource for them in navigating the climate catastrophe. And this creates climate resilience, I would say. Looking more at the Swedish context, something that was very clear in the Swedish material is that the climate crisis doesn't really affect the interviewees' daily lives at the same level as for the South African activists. So for the Swedish activists, the climate crisis is somehow still a bit far away, like a storm coming, and that creates a lot of climate anxiety. So climate anxiety is a very strong theme in the Swedish material, and I quote Ove. I got horrible climate anxiety, and the whole world was about to falling apart. We're on our way towards a catastrophe, and it hit me in a way. And in this process, I was trying, what do I do now? End quote. So this climate anxiety is very strong in the Swedish material, and that is what initiates them to start with their activism. And they focus very much or exclusively on mitigation efforts, both campaigning for policies and politicians to work on mitigation of fossil fuel emissions and changing the society to become fossil fuel free. And this means also focusing a lot on lifestyle issues. And they can focus on the climate crisis exclusively. They don't link the climate crisis to other challenges in their activism. Looking at the cultural and religious context of Sweden, the activists are withdrawing from society because they see the contemporary society as the problem. So they really withdraw from the society, but that means also they don't have any existing paths compared to the South African activists. So their activism is really characterized by a disconnection process where they disconnect from the society through different practices like contemplation and like these pilgrimages that they sort of distance themselves from society. But they also reconnect to their spirituality and they reconnect to God through contemplative practices. And it's very common within the Swedish material that these Swedish activists have a lot of spiritual experiences during their activism, experiences of feeling interconnected to nature, for example, or meeting God through some trees. The trees are talking to me and I hear God's voice, for example. Or having a spiritual experience of being dependent on others and on nature. So where are they heading where they're pathfinding? That's also a bit different in the two contexts. I start with a quote by Stembiso in the South African context. He says, "A future vision for me is that a child in a rural area can study and have the same opportunities as a child studying in the city. I mean, a child in the city can sit with air conditioning and study, but a child in a rural area must maybe in the future study in temperatures of 35 to 40 degrees. A future vision for me is that we take care of the brains of children," end quote. So for the South Africans, it's very much heading toward securing fundamental rights, and food security is the main thing that unites them, but also other kinds of rights, like Stembiso's quote, "the rights to education." And compared to the Swedish context, they focus entirely on, when I ask them about their future visions, it's to create fossil fuel-free societies. But that also integrates a reorientation of what does it mean to be human, to a reorientation of values, etc. But what unites the two contexts is that they draw on diverse sources of knowledge when I ask them about future visions. They integrate science and faith at the same time. They don't reject science, they rely on science in their activism. That's the foundation, even though it's mainly experience-based climate knowledge that functions as their landmark. But while science gives them despair about the future, about having these negative outlooks about the future, faith, on the other hand, gives them hope. But it's not like they're having a clear vision of how to develop exactly a clear picture of where we're heading, but they really trust in God, and this reliance on God makes them free to also act. So to rely on God on one hand and take climate action on the other is just two sides of the same activist coin. So trust in God is very important in their activism. So finally, some words about what I see as their main strength in their pathfinding process. In South Africa, it's resilience. I see that they can draw on their context, on their history, on their community. They have these collective spiritual identities of being interconnected to nature, to the land, to others, to God, to ancestors. They have key figures in the past, like anti-apartheid fighters. So they have a very rich source for resilience that they use as a climate resilience. And they also engage in these environmental projects within their local communities. So they also actively create climate resilient communities in which reliance on God serves as a very important factor for resilience. Meanwhile, the strength in the Swedish material is their ability to reorient, and how they reorient through faith in practice. And even though they see these fossil fuel-free societies as their vision, faith is really a dimension that helps them to navigate and to develop other ways of living. And this Pilgrim's Walk for Future that I was mentioning in the beginning really was an event where they, during this event, explored new ways of living and new ideas of how we could live. So they sort of explored their future visions while they were walking and while they were doing this climate activism. So they reorient what it means to be human, and they reorient what it means to be a sustainable society. So that is the main strength in the Swedish material. So I will end by giving two quotes illustrating these two different strengths. I start with South Africa. Betty, she says, any activist faith is very important because it's what carries you through the tough times and makes you believe you're going to come right eventually. If you do your part, then you know God will surely do God's part. End quote. And finally, a quote by Thomas illustrating the reorientation process. We can no longer believe in any human-made roads, but we must recognize the facts. We must capitulate. When it is not possible straight ahead, then it's possible up and down. So like we change orientation. End quote. So thank you. That was my presentation.
And thank you so much for an absolutely excellent presentation. We are all learned an awful lot.